Hello and welcome to the Progress Theory, where we discuss how to implement scientific principles to optimise human performance. On today's episode, we welcome Dr Rich Blagrove, lecturer in Physiology and S&C from Loughborough University and researcher into strength training for middle and long distance running performance. Rich has a wealth of knowledge and experience of over 10 years in terms of coaching runners, but also researching how strength training can improve running performance. In today's episode, we discuss important topics such as what factors separate elite and amateur runners, how implementing strength training can improve your own running performance, and also how implementing strength training may reduce the chance of you experiencing an injury. Whether you're an experienced runner or you're someone new to the sport, there are plenty of take-home messages from this episode that you can use to implement into your own training. As always, please follow the Progress Theory on Instagram and YouTube, and also go back and watch all of our previous episodes. But for now, here is Dr. Rich Blagrove. Dr. Rich Blagrove, how are we?
Yeah, good, thanks, Phil. How are you?
No, I'm not too bad. First of all, congratulations, because a new book is out and it's already sold out.
Yeah, the new book came out a couple of days ago now, I think. And yeah, I think Amazon's saying that it's sold out, but it's probably because they didn't buy very many.
They didn't stock enough.
No, exactly. There's hardly any in the warehouse in the first place.
No, I was sure it was pretty popular. Like, I remember contacting you when I first saw it was coming out for the pre-order, and I was like, "Oh, we've got to get you on the Progress Theory so we can chat about it." And I never expected to be sold out within a day. I think they probably stock more than you're thinking. Don't be so humble. It's going to be. I'm looking forward to reading it. I haven't got it just yet. I'm still waiting for my order. So
yeah, I hope so.
You get them stocked up at the St Mary's Library.
Yeah, definitely. Get onto the librarian for sure. Hopefully it's useful for sports scientists and anybody that's got an interest in middle and long distance running.
But before we go and discuss the book in a little bit more detail, do you want to give a bit of an overview about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a lecturer in physiology and the programme leader for the Masters in Strength and Conditioning at Loughborough University. Before that, I was a senior lecturer in sport and exercise science at Birmingham City University. And before that, I worked with UPhil at St Mary's University for almost 9 years, actually, where I was the programme director for the undergraduate degree in strength and conditioning science. I guess alongside all those academic roles that I've had over the last 13 years now, I've always coached strength and conditioning. So in the early days, I worked with athletes across a multitude of different sports, but then I guess I've kind of unintentionally specialised a little bit and work with middle and long distance runners. And my PhD was looking at the effects of strength training exercise with post-pubertal adolescent middle distance runners. And I've kind of just carried on that research a little bit since I've started at Loughborough. I've got a couple of PhD students who are looking at running economy specifically and how we can potentially lower injury risk with endurance runners.
Okay. So definitely 2 or 3 topics there that we wanted to talk about during this podcast.
Yeah. Seamless link.
Exactly. Do you want to go into a bit more detail about your book? Because that's providing a really good overview of strength training for middle and long distance runners. You've sent me the contents list, so it's really quite extensive. What was the aim with the book, and what key things did you want to get across?
Yeah, so this project started not too long after I finished my PhD in 2018. I was kind of looking around, I guess, in a geeky way to try and get my teeth stuck into something else. And I didn't have any of my own PhD students that I was supervising at the time. I presented at a few conferences around that period, and I was talking to a lot of distance running coaches and other sports scientists that were presenting at the conference. And we were all kind of agreeing that there's quite a lot of poor information that's put across in running magazines and on the internet and so on. And I guess kind of alongside that, I'm on quite a few like Twitter, Facebook type groups where lots of runners discuss things related to sports science. And there's just quite a lot of kind of misinformation and myths associated with a lot of topics within sports science. So everything from running technique to nutrition and different supplementation, and then the best ways to train and the best approaches to training. And I'm kind of very aware that there aren't really any other books available, or at least the books are quite old, that try to cover lots of sports science related topics related to middle and long distance running. So I kind of just sat down one day and got quite excited that I was like, well, I'm in quite a lucky position here in that I've worked with loads of distance running coaches, loads of sports science practitioners who are kind of widely regarded as world leaders in their own areas. So I kind of had this network, and I was like, I could write this textbook with these 22 different topics and chapters, all based around different sports science issues for distance runners, and it will kind of plug this gap in the literature and hopefully start filtering down to grassroots and recreational runners to kind of get rid of some of this misinformation that's around. So that's how it started, really. And I guess 6 months after that, I sort of regretted doing it to some extent because it turned into quite a big task. But yeah, certainly now it's out. I'm really happy that I did it, and hopefully it will be a useful resource.
Yeah, it's amazing that you've created something that's going to bridge the gap between the research out there and those that are wishing to apply that research, and doing it in such a way that's very understandable and can easily see just how easily applied this research can be, and see really good improvements in people's running based on just focusing on these and having good understanding and knowledge over these basic topics regarding strength training for running. I'd like to start off by giving an overview of what is necessary for being a good runner. So what are the main skills and physical qualities that you would like to see in a runner, which ultimately led you to deciding which topics you wanted to cover in your book?
Yeah, it's a great question to kick off with. And I think, as most people will be aware, we know running, middle long distance running, it's an endurance type activity. So it's mainly limited by physiological attributes. So like our heart, our lungs, the way in which our muscles are using carbohydrates and fats to create energy. And there's been a few kind of models, I guess, that have been put out over the years to try and describe what the different physiological components are that explain variability in performance. So can, in other words, explain who runs fast and who runs slow over a given distance. And it kind of boils down to three main factors. So you've got maximal oxygen uptake that people abbreviate to VO2 max. And that's the most amount of oxygen that a runner can take from the atmosphere, bring into their body via their lungs, and then transport from their lungs around their vascular system towards the working muscles. And I guess that's kind of our gold standard measure. So that one best explains who's going to be fast, who's going to be slow over a 10K or a marathon type distance. As a second factor, we've also got something called fractional utilization, which is basically a fancy way of saying it's the percentage or the fraction of VO2 max that I can access for a given distance or duration. So very good runners are capable of sustaining very high percentages of their VO2 max for quite long durations, whereas more recreational runners can sustain much lower percentages. And then we've also got running economy. So running economy, sometimes people refer to as efficiency, is essentially how much energy or oxygen I need to sustain a given submaximal intensity of exercise. So if I'm completing a 10K or a marathon, I'm obviously at a submaximal running speed, and it's how much energy or oxygen I'm using in order to complete that effort. So those are the three main factors, I guess, and they obviously vary quite a lot across different runners.
That might be a good opportunity to do a bit of a comparison between the elite runners and, say, an amateur marathon runner. So you've listed three key qualities there: the VO2 max, the practical utilization, and running economy. So how, obviously, for the elite runners, those three components are going to be better, greater. But how would it look like if you compared it to an amateur athlete? How much better are the elite athletes regarding VO2 max, regarding running economy? What's the gap between the elite guys and the amateur ones?
Yeah, you're exactly right. So we see differences across all three of those components. So, for example, with VO2 max, so when I get a well-trained or elite runner in the lab, a male runner would typically see high 70s, maybe low 80s for a VO2 max score. And that compares to your recreational runner who would typically be kind of mid to high 50s. So I don't know what that is in terms of a percentage, but it's, about 20 millilitres per kilogram per minute less. And then similarly for females, we typically see elite runners hitting scores of in the low 70s, whereas at the recreational level, it's more like high 40s, maybe low 50s-ish. Similarly with the percentage of VO2 max that we can sustain, so the fractional utilization, there's been a recent paper that came out that showed that Kipchoge, so the guy that was the first one to run under 2 hours for the marathon, he sustains about 87 to 90% of his VO2 max for that entire 2 hours, which is pretty phenomenal. And you compare that to kind of the masses in the London Marathon or any other major city marathon, and they'll be operating at around about 60, maybe 65% of their VO2 max. So again, there's a difference of 25, 30% there. And the interesting thing with VO2 max is that in well-trained and elite runners, we typically don't see very much difference in it. So it doesn't explain differences in performance very well. So in other words, the athlete that crosses the line first in like a major city marathon will have a similar VO2 max to the guy that finishes 10th and probably 20th as well. So the first 20 runners across the line will have quite similar scores. But what's super interesting, at least for me, is that their running economy often differs quite a lot, and it differentiates performance much more accurately. And so usually the guys that win the medals in the big races are the ones with the better running economy against the guys that are coming maybe 20, 30th. And then if you go further down the field towards the moderately and lesser trained runners, their economy gets worse still. So economy is a really useful measure for us in terms of trying to explain who's going to be the best performer.
I remember when I started doing the marathon training before Christmas, and I put on my Instagram that I was looking more into the physiological determinants of running performance. And you got in contact and sent me a load of papers. And one in particular, which I particularly liked, I think was by Andy Jones in regards to his work with Paula Radcliffe. And that was saying how Paula Radcliffe actually kind of peaked in her VO2 max towards her late teens, maybe early 20s, but she continued to get better and better throughout her career. And it was running economy that improved those times. So it was like, okay, throughout her career spanning, 25 years, including, going through the ranks as a teenager, that's when she was seeing like improvements in running economy and VO2 max leading up to like 20, 21 years old. But it was that peaked, and then it was the running economy that's improved from then, and that's what took her to the heights that she achieved in her career.
Yeah.
And I find that quite fascinating.
No, absolutely. And that case study on Paula Radcliffe kind of illustrates that exact point that I was just making really nicely. And there's been a couple of other similar case studies from cycling and cross-country skiing and things. And they are only one person, but they're quite useful because we don't often have access to data in athletes over years and years and years to sort of longitudinally see how their physiological attributes are changing. And I kind of saw similar with my PhD data in that, again, I was really lucky to have, I think, 6 athletes across all of my PhD studies that were national champions in their age groups. So you'd have like a 16-year-old female athlete would come in and they'd be the national cross-country champion or the English school's 3,000 metre champion. So they were like the best 16-year-old in the whole of the UK. And some of the VO2 max scores that those 6 national champions were getting were just absolutely phenomenal. I saw the male athletes getting high 70s, and I think the highest was just over 80. And some of the females were in the low 70s, which is, for a 16-year-old, that's comparable to Paula Radcliffe, who used to hold the world record for the marathon. And so, I'm not entirely sure whether they'd topped out their VO2 max kind of genetically, like it might still improve a little bit. But my feeling is that, their other qualities, so that the fractional utilization and their economy, would probably improve more over the next sort of 5 to 10 years.
And I guess knowing that gives you the opportunity to make decisions on what you might want to concentrate on when actually developing a training program to get that athlete to improve their performance. And I think that nicely leads towards the question around strength training, because often strength training is utilized to improve running performance. But out of those three components, how does strength training actually improve them? And I guess a lot of the improvements you see from strength training are attributed to running economy. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly that. So with maximal oxygen uptake, so VO2 max and fractional utilization, they're mainly limited by central factors, so our kind of heart and lungs, and the ability to kind of get the oxygen to the working muscles, and then some limitations at a muscle level as well, so metabolic type things. But the interesting thing about economy is there's definitely things associated with physiology that are important, but it's also heavily related to biomechanics. So the way in which a runner is running in terms of their technique, and the way in which they're managing and controlling forces when their foot hits the ground. And then also neuromuscular factors as well. So obviously for me as a strength and conditioning coach, it's like, okay, there's things related to the muscle and the tendon which determine running economy. So therefore, if I can put in place some sort of intervention, so i.e. strength training, to try and improve some of these neuromuscular qualities, we should get an improvement in economy and therefore an improvement in performance. And yeah, as you allude to, that's typically what we see. That if we put a runner through a strength training intervention which lasts 2, 3, 4 months, we see improvements in running economy of about 4%-ish on average. And therefore we typically get improvements in time trial performance.
So that additional 4% increase in running economy on top of a nearly maxed out VO2 max surely is going to see some really, 4% doesn't seem too big, but really in the grand scheme of things, it's really quite an impressive improvement. And that's just from adding appropriate strength training in.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, yeah, as you say, like a 4% improvement for a well-trained or elite runner is absolutely huge. Like it would potentially make the difference between making a podium and not making a podium, or hitting a qualifying time and not. And I think for a long time, like certainly when I first started getting interested in this area, there was a lot of studies and review articles that were kind of saying strength training is this thing that only elite runners should be doing because of that reason. But we published a systematic review as part of my PhD, and it kind of suggested that wasn't the case, because a lot of the scientific experiments have been done with more recreational and moderately trained runners, and they also see similar improvements in economy. So although obviously running is got to be the most important thing if running is your main goal, adding some strength training as well is also going to give more moderately trained runners a boost to their economy and therefore help their performance.
So what types of strength training would you include in a runner's strength training program? You highlighted key physiological structures like the tendon and the muscle. Like, what types of training should we do to try and improve running economy by developing adaptations in these body structures?
Yeah, so I think on a very general level, and without getting into a whole strength and conditioning degree or masters, you can probably group strength training into three main areas. So you've got heavy resistance training, which is kind of lifting your barbells, dumbbells, kettlebells mainly, for repetition ranges of up to about 8 or so. You've got explosive resistance training, which is moving light to moderate loads as quickly as we possibly can. So that would be things like throwing a medicine ball, maybe jumping onto a big box, and then weightlifting skills, so things like clean and jerks and snatches, which obviously are a big part of strength and conditioning. And then the third category being plyometric exercises, which are things like jumps, hopping and bounding, where essentially we're trying to travel across the surface or rebound off the surface with as short a ground contact time as possible. And again, going back to the review that I mentioned before, we found that these, like all three of these different strength training activities, seem to offer benefits, and there doesn't seem to be one out of those three which is better than the other. And so therefore, usually my recommendation to most runners is that they attempt to try and include all of these, either across a training year with some sort of periodized model, or a little bit more concurrently, and that there's bits of heavy resistance training, there's some explosive work, and there's some plyometric training, but we're maybe like emphasizing a little bit more or less of each during different parts of the training year.
So one of the questions that we had written into us, what we've done is on Instagram, I put out a post trying to get as many questions as possible ready for this podcast. And we got a few, and we've decided to try and infiltrate them into our questions that we wanted to discuss. So thank you everyone that did submit any questions. But there's one quite interesting question, which I believe was by Rob Oren. So Rob, thank you for putting your question in. And that was towards what you were describing about plyometric exercise. Now, you could argue that running itself, because of the short contact times, is a plyometric exercise itself. So what are your recommendations of including plyometrics training into a strength training program for a runner, considering that they're getting a lot of plyometric actions in their sport already?
Yeah, thanks a lot for the question, Rob. It is a really good question. Just quickly to recap what I mentioned. So, I mean, we know through the scientific literature, so the intervention studies that have used plyometric training, that it is a really potent stimulus. Like it's great at improving economy compared to just running alone. So compared to a control group that's only carrying on their normal training. And so the reason why it's a good thing is because it's quite biomechanically similar. Like if you think about the running action, it's unilateral. So we're going from right foot to left foot. The foot hits the ground. We get a lengthening initially of the muscle tendon unit, and then we get a shortening. And so if you think about jumping exercises, hopping, bounding, they're similar joint angles, and the muscle and tendon are behaving in a similar type of way. But what we're doing with plyometric exercises is trying to increase the loading demand, so how much force is going through the body, by either jumping higher than kind of what we typically do as part of the running action, or traveling further horizontally across the ground. So that not only increases the force demand, so therefore we get some strength changes within the nervous system and the muscle, but it also increases the potential for the tendon to store energy. And so if we give the tendon more energy, what we're essentially trying to do through a process of adaptation is teach it to store and return that energy. So therefore, we're getting more sort of free energy from the tendons after we've completed a plyometric intervention. I think the other part of Rob's question was, well, running's plyometric, so why not just kind of do running? And that makes complete sense. But essentially, we're trying to overload the mechanisms of plyometrics. If you think about running like a fairly low intensity plyometric, fast running, maybe a moderate intensity, sprinting, definitely a moderate intensity plyometric. Like what we're trying to do is overload the muscle and tendon. So we're trying to encourage it to become stronger and store and return more elastic energy. So we don't need a huge amount of volume of this. Typically with the runners that I work with, the novice ones are only doing about 30 to 40 foot contacts or sort of repetitions of plyometric training. And the ones that have been doing it a few years are doing maybe 70, 80, or maybe 90 at very most. And that would represent like a really...
Is that per week or per session?
So that's per session, sorry. And they'll be doing a couple of bouts of this type of work. And that's quite a meaningful dosage. And probably much more than that, you're going to start risking tendon-related injuries potentially. And so, yeah, going back to what I mentioned before, so we know that this is quite a useful stimulus and seems to get us good changes in running economy and sprinting speed and so on.
And you can definitely see the link, because running economy is about expending less energy when you're running at a certain speed. If you then improve the tendon's ability to store and return elastic energy, there's no energy cost associated with that. So if the tendons are better at doing that, less energy cost, that means they can maintain a higher speed, the body can maintain a higher running speed, but for less energy. So you can definitely see the link between why you should include this type of training for a long distance runner.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's because plyometrics is quite high intensity for a strength exercise. It's definitely more high intensity than running and probably even sprinting. like you do have to be a little bit careful with the way that you prescribe it. Like start more down at the low to moderate end of the intensity range, and then gradually over months and probably years, just start nudging up the intensity and the volume as well. And yeah, just being cautious with how you're kind of progressing it, so you don't risk injury.
There definitely seems to be there's a certain amount of volume of strength training or plyometric training that you should do, and then anything greater than that could have negative returns, possibly injury. Have you ever seen examples where maybe not just plyometric training, but examples where runners have done too much strength training, and that in turn has led to either decrements in performance or potential injury?
Not too many examples. Certainly none of the athletes that I've worked with, but I would say that, wouldn't I? Yeah, I mean, a lot of runners are often a little bit skeptical about definitely lifting weights, but just strength training a little bit more generally. So even getting them to do a small amount is often quite difficult. So there's not a huge risk that they're going to do too much, I guess. I guess the ones that are a bit more keener or buy into it a little bit quicker, the point at which they're probably doing too much is when it's starting to consistently impact their running training. And so either if they put too much volume within a session, or they're not allowing enough recovery between a strength training session and their higher intensity running sessions within the week, you could probably say, okay, you've not quite got the dosage right because it's impacting the most important running training sessions of your week. So therefore, we either need to back off a little bit on the volume, still try and achieve some benefit, or we need to change the organisation of your strength training within the week. So I think that's probably the only occasion when they're probably doing too much. Like most of the recommendations, and certainly our guideline from the review article, was that probably 2 sessions a week is enough to achieve some of the benefits that I've already described. Some studies use 3 sessions a week, but yeah, they don't really see very much more benefit. And yeah, a lot of the studies don't really see very much change in muscle mass or body composition as a result of engaging with strength training, at least for a few months. So there's not very much danger of this kind of hypertrophy response, so an increase in muscle mass. But I guess if you were to do loads, and again, I've not really seen this happen, but if you were to do 3, 4, 5 strength training sessions a week, and you're starting to neglect the running training, then there's obviously going to be a risk of developing muscle mass, which is potentially then disadvantageous to running performance.
I guess you start to understand how everyone's response to strength training is going to be very individual. And you, like you said about reducing the volume if you think you're doing too much, or reducing the volume of strength training if you're starting to see it affecting the running training, because that's the number one thing you should be focusing on. And obviously it's going to be quite auto-regulated. Everyone's trying to find that sweet spot, the right amount of volume, which is going to improve running, but not to the point where it has a negative effect on running.
Yeah, exactly that. So yeah, we've kind of got our sort of guidelines which emerge from the scientific literature as a start point, but it's, yeah, as you say, it's 100% then got to be individualized according to like numerous different factors, and then yeah, tweaked and changed almost on a session by session basis according to how the runner's feeling, how they're responding to the training, any kind of aches, pains, niggles they might be carrying. And I think certainly when I was based down at St Mary's with you, I think that's why I was able to achieve quite a lot of success with runners, because I was able to almost see them on a day-to-day basis. And so I was able to offer suggestions around how they should be tweaking and changing any non-running related aspects of their training to make sure we avoided injury and tried to optimize the performance in their sessions. Most of the coaching that I do now is a bit more consultancy based, so I don't get to see my runners very often. And it makes it much more difficult because you're relying on communication via text messages and WhatsApps and things like that. So you don't build up that same level of communication and relationship that allows you to tweak and change training effectively. Like we're getting away with it so far, but it's much more difficult in that type of environment.
So we kind of talked about how doing too much strength training could potentially lead to injury, but also strength training can actually reduce the risk of injury, especially when given the right amount. How does that work?
Yeah, it's a really good question for the main reason that we did a survey as part of my PhD, which had like 2,000 responses. So it was a pretty good sample size. And what we found was the most common reason why runners incorporate any type of strength and conditioning into their week is to try and reduce the risk of them getting injured, which is kind of surprising in some ways, because what we've already gone through so far is all around strength training improves economy and it improves performance. So surely that should be the main reason. And a kind of, equally convincing body of literature doesn't really exist for strength training reducing risk of overuse injury in runners, surprisingly. So I guess the way that like S&C coaches and physios would come at this is largely theoretical. Like, we know through like quite a big body of work that like heavy mechanical loading, so like heavy resistance training or plyometrics, is a really, really good stimulus for improving bone mineral density, tendon density, and some studies looking at tendon cross-sectional area, like definitely resilience of ligaments and changes in fascicle length, so we can cope with like heavy eccentric loading cycles a little bit better. And so therefore, if we improve the kind of resilience and capacity of these tissues, we should be able to cope with greater volumes or intensities of running training before that tissue kind of reaches its threshold of failure, if you like, and we start to get pain or some sort of injury. If we then overlay the kind of correlation evidence, so what I mean by this is there's been quite a few studies over the years that have shown that low hip strength, so particularly like if you've got weak glutes, that seems to be related to injuries like gluteal tendinopathy, IT band, so iliotibial band syndrome, knee pain, patellofemoral pain, and even one or two studies looking at Achilles tendonitis. So that would kind of suggest that if I strengthen my glutes, I'm less likely to get those types of injuries. But actually, when you look at the intervention study, so a study that's tried to strengthen the glutes and then looked at incidence of injury over a long period of time, there aren't really very many studies that have shown that that's the case. They are quite poor studies. So in other words, like the groups of participants they use don't get supervised. Most of the exercise interventions, certainly me and you wouldn't regard as strength training. They're kind of these home-based types of interventions. They're often quite short, so they may be only a few months long, and so we probably need a longer period of time to actually get the adaptation and then see it have a positive impact on injury rates. There's been one study which was done in the military, so soldiers that were undergoing basic training, and they were doing a lot of running work as part of that. And they showed that if we use a high frequency approach to strength training, so they were doing strength training every single day as part of their warm-up for about 15-20 minutes, so they saw lower injury rates compared to a group of soldiers that weren't doing that and were just doing their normal running training. So it might be that a higher frequency approach and a kind of micro dose type approach is the better strategy to try and offset the risk of injuries. And sorry to go on with this point, but I guess the final point around it is we can kind of look to work in other sports and other training activities. And like you'll know as well as me, Phil, there's a lot of work to show that injury rates are reduced, particularly acute injuries, things like strains and sprains and traumatic injuries to the knee, like ACL injuries, if we expose athletes to strength training interventions. And so we can kind of use some of that literature, I guess, to help us create an argument that strength training is going to help runners.
It still comes across as an area that we don't fully understand, usually because there's so many factors in play. I think you like to think that, okay, if I did like a strength training program, you use the glutes as an example. One, is that going to just improve the tolerance of the tissues? So that then in turn leads to a potential reduction risk and injury? Or does it help improve strength? So then the muscular strategy to perform the sports skill then changes, and that is more efficient, and therefore there's less chance of injury. But you'd like to think, being stronger in general will improve those two particular factors, but I guess we don't really know. And a lot of that is down to the methodological differences in the studies? I mean, you highlighted a few in your description, and you know the literature considerably more than me. There must have been quite a lot of differences in methodologies, but also a lot of factors which you'd think weren't included in the study but would affect it. So like length of the intervention, like intervention studies always seem to be around 8 to 12 weeks.
Yeah.
And, you know, to be honest, you might need much longer than that to actually see any positive influence from it. But
yeah, you're exactly right. And like the reason that any individual runner picks up an injury is going to be multifactorial. Like it's going to be really complicated. And so weakness around either the site of injury or something further up the kinetic chain, like something further up their leg, might be a factor. But then again, it might not. Like it might be nothing to do with it. And so I think that's where runners need like a decent physio that's hopefully worked with runners in the past. Maybe some input from a biomechanist to kind of look at their gait and their technique. And then as well as a strength and conditioning coach that can do some strength-based tests. And I think when you start to put all of the information together from those different practitioners, you start to build up a picture of, okay, the reason you've picked up this injury is probably this reason. And then you can put in place an intervention that's a bit more individualized.
okay, let's get into some more applied questions. So I'm definitely interested to see what your opinions are on these. So say we've got two examples. We've got athlete A and we've got athlete B. One is trying to improve, say they're amateur athletes. One's trying to improve their 5K time. The other one's trying to improve their marathon time. Both involve lots of running. But what kind of key differences do you think you would see in their strength training based on the fact that they are trying to improve in different distances?
Yeah, I think for so for your example for 5K and marathon, I don't think there'd be a huge difference in the approach that I would use for strength training, mainly because, like, we know that running economy is a really important determinant of performance for both of those. It seems to become more important as the distance increases. And so marathon runners, their performance is heavily influenced by running economy, like more so than 10K and 5K. But I'm not sure it would really change my approach to like the screening and testing process and then the recommendations that I would put in place. I guess the one area that it might is that typically with the runners that I've worked with in the past that have moved up from your kind of 5K, 10K distances towards the marathon, is the main thing that changes about their training is the length of their longer run of the week. And so typically that might be on a Sunday, let's say, and they maybe go from running, I don't know, 80, 90 minutes on a Sunday to all of a sudden they're running 2 hours plus. And that obviously then impacts them for the sort of 24, 48 hours after their long Sunday run. And so if you've got a strength and conditioning session planned for the Monday morning and it's got like plyometrics and squats going through a lot of range of movement, like they're going to struggle to hit those sorts of positions. So it maybe changes your exercise selection. It maybe changes where you put your plyometric training in the week. Because if you overload them too much in that period after a very long run, you're going to be risking injury, and obviously it's going to be influencing the recovery. I think probably like a slightly different example. And sorry to change your case study, Phil. But certainly for middle distance runners, so like I work a lot with 800, 1500 meter runners, and their prescription differs not a lot, but it differs a little bit from your kind of half marathon runner because of the speeds they have to operate at, particularly at this sort of time of year. So they're kind of in pre-season at the moment, and then moving into track season. That we kind of know from the research that up to about, I think it's about 24, 25 kilometers an hour, we know that the muscles around the calf are the ones that are contributing most in terms of proportion to the work that's being performed. So for sort of 5K upwards runners, like being really, really strong in the calf complex and being strong through the Achilles tendon is absolutely key. Whereas at speeds above 25 kilometers an hour, which is pretty fast, but the sort of speeds they're hitting in interval training sessions for 800 and 1500 meters, we know that the contribution from the hip becomes much, much more important. And so being really, really strong in the glutes, so the glute max, in order to improve maximal speeds and some of those more anaerobic capacities is important. We know the hamstrings come under a huge amount of strain when we're getting close towards top speeds. So therefore, making sure the hamstrings are as resilient and robust as possible becomes really important for those middle distance guys. And so therefore, I kind of bias the training a little bit more around the hip, I guess, for those middle distance guys. And it's probably a little bit more biased around the foot and ankle for the longer distance guys. But again, that's kind of a large generalization.
No, that's really quite interesting. I mean, the next question, which you kind of already answered, was, okay, someone has just done a half marathon. What kind of changes would they need to do if they wanted to go up to do a marathon distance? And what you were kind of saying, especially the difference between 5K and a marathon distance, is that the training modalities doesn't really change. However, how you organize your week and the changes in frequency and volumes is obviously going to change, because all of a sudden you're doing much longer runs. However, when you start to really push up the speed, and because you're doing lower distances, maybe 1,500 and sort of 800 meters, maybe even further, the focus of developing certain musculature goes further up the chain. So the longer, slower distances focus around the calf and the Achilles complex. But as they get faster and faster, you want to focus more on hip extensions, the glute max and the hamstrings. So I think that's a really cool way of looking at running and where you might want to focus.
Yeah, for sure. And like I say, it's a big generalization. Like I don't want to put the message out that longer distance runners not doing glute work is a good thing. Like all the 10K marathon runners that I've worked with in the past will be doing a lot of stuff around the glutes. But yeah, the contribution of those muscles towards the speed that they're running at is like fairly minimal. Like they play a kind of supporting role, but the majority of kind of positive work that's been produced as part of the gait cycle when the foot's in contact with the ground is mainly coming from, well, to be really specific, like the soleus muscle, which is the deeper muscle within your calf complex. So therefore, making sure that muscle in particular is really strong, resilient as a priority seems to be quite important. But then still obviously keeping in your hip thrusts and your RDLs and your back squats to make sure that the glutes are still really strong.
One other question, moving away from strength training, really, I wanted to ask, this was also put towards us on Instagram, is we've got S&C coach who's supposed to be very knowledgeable about the technical skill of running, and ultimately that is going to lead them to make certain decisions around training. Training therefore means they have to make decisions around volumes of training. But then you've got the running coach as well, who does a similar role with trying to understand, when they run, how long they run, how fast they run, that sort of thing. So it does sound like the roles overlap. So I think the question is more around, so if this is the case, how much is an S&C coach involved? What is their role? If you've got an athlete and they've got an S&C coach and a running coach, how much involved should the S&C coach be, especially because their decisions are so based off the fact that how much running that they're doing?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So I didn't catch who sent it in, but thanks for that question. And I mean, you'll be able to relate to this, certainly, Phil, that there's always going to be some overlap between the remit that the strength and conditioning coach has and that of the technical coach, like whether we're talking about invasion game sports or court racket type sports and then endurance sports as well. Like for me, it's always just important that when I first start to work with an athlete and I maybe meet their technical coach for the first time, it's just being clear on sort of where that remit sits and like where the boundary is and what their expectations are of me. So do they kind of consider me like a bit more of a kind of wider sports scientist and kind of want to look after aspects of gait retraining, recovery strategies, like maybe bits of nutrition here and there? Or do they just see me as sort of the strength coach, like set this athlete a weights program and that's all we really need you for? I guess the two biggest areas that I've sort of seen over the years where the responsibilities overlap is probably the warm-up, because the way that I quite like to use the warm-up as a strength and conditioning coach is it's an opportunity to develop some fundamental movement skills. It's an opportunity to kind of microdose a little bit of strength work, even if it's just with some elastic band type resistance. And there's definitely an opportunity to do some maximal velocity sprinting, even if it's just short distance and a few repetitions, and also potentially some plyometric type work, both because we know that that's a good stimulus to get to change running economy and performance, but also it kind of primes them for the session as well. And we should get some improvements in performance within the session if we do that work. And so if the technical coach kind of allows me to have some input into the structure and the content of the warm-up, I think over a long-term period of time, that can be really beneficial. But there's obviously other occasions where the technical coach is like, no, they do a 15-minute jog, couple of strides, and then I need them into the session. And so I don't really have very much input. And then the second area is probably changes to running technique. And kind of in the sports science literature, that would be referred to as sort of gait retraining. And gait retraining, it's a really topical area. Like I think physios, biomechanists, S&C coach, technical coaches, they're all really interested in it. And I think the way in which our kind of mind works as a strength and conditioning coach is that we're movement coaches. Movement's really important. We need to set athletes up in the kind of shapes and positions that allow them to express forces really well and to control and modulate forces really well. But the majority of the literature for around running technique kind of shows that, at least for economy and also for prevention of injury, that it maybe isn't actually that important, that you see athletes with quite what we would consider not aesthetically pleasing running techniques. Like they look kind of quite ugly when they run, yet they've got really good economies and they don't really seem to get very many injuries. And then you see another athlete who looks really beautiful, really fluent and nice with the way they run. And they're just constantly picking up different niggles and it doesn't really make very much sense. And so like, I think where we end up with gait retraining is that it is very, very individual. And that if a runner is getting a lot of injuries, then it's perhaps one area that we might look at to try and change either the way their foot's hitting the ground, like where their foot's hitting the ground in relation to the center of mass, like their ankle, knee, hip alignment, potentially what their pelvis is doing. And so we could potentially tweak and change some of these things. And so that's sometimes been part of my remit as the S&C coach, and other times it's been something that the technical coach has taken care of.
No, I noticed that gait retraining was an important chapter in your new book, and that was one of the ones that I was really looking forward to. And when you were describing how it seems very individualized, where you see someone that looks like has a gait that is very different from what the technical model says, and that, you know, they're really economical and they have minimal injuries compared to someone that almost like looks exactly like the technical model, yet they're always injured. It made me think of, what's the 5K runner? It's a Chapter guy.
Yeah.
And there was a picture of his foot and how much the arch had collapsed to the point where it looked like he was running on his tibias. And people were saying, look, it's really quite individualized because this guy has just run the most perfect 5K race ever. And look at his feet. So it shows just how varied things are. And I'm really looking forward to looking at that particular chapter, because I think there's going to be a lot of gems in there that can make you think about questions when you're looking at each individual gait that you're working with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think similar to the discussion that we had before, like maybe with this area of science, there's just not been the robust enough, like well-designed enough studies to investigate it. Mainly because if you think about like the majority of sports skills that where we would try and prioritize perfecting technique, like trying to train movement to make it a bit more optimized, like a lot of those are kind of like one-off skills, or you maybe do the skill and then have a recovery and then you kind of do it again. Whereas if you think about running, like your foot's hitting the ground 3 times every single second. So even with a recreational runner, like the number of times they've practiced and ingrained that skill is obviously tens of thousands of times. And so like they're obviously going to be quite efficient and economical within their own technique, even if it's quite a bad technique, if that makes sense. So they've just learned to kind of self-optimize within their own constraints and their own chosen technical pattern. And so therefore, if you try and make a change to it, it obviously, like the way that we would measure it then in the lab is, okay, you're less economical now, but it's just because you've taken them out of what they're very, very familiar with, if that makes sense. So maybe you do need a much more longer term study. And it's the same with injury. Like if you perform the same pattern tens of thousands of times, your tissues that are being exposed to the load are obviously going to get really, really familiar with it. So really robust. So with your example of Chapter guy, yeah, he's got this huge amount of pronation, like this inversion at the ankle and so on. So whatever tissues are being exposed to that load as part of his training are going to become like probably super resilient, even if they're not the most appropriate tissues to load, if that makes sense. And so therefore he'll be familiar with it. He'll be economical with the technique. The tissues would have adapted to the load that's being imposed upon them, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's right for everybody. Or he would have been better with a different technique had he have learnt a different strategy, perhaps. And so, yeah, I think it's a difficult question for science to unpick.
Like most, we still need more. We still need more research to understand this area.
Yeah, that's always what we end up saying.
Yeah. Well, Rich, that was incredible. Thank you so much for coming on the Progress Theory. I've read your research over the years, and it was great to sort of read your systematic review again. As soon as you were coming on this podcast, I was like straight to that systematic review. It was great to. I've read pieces of individual research by you, but it was great to have a complete synthesis of everything you've done over the last few years. Well, it's probably the last 10 years actually. So yeah, it was really good to hear it, and I'm really looking forward to reading your book as well. Where can people get in contact with you if they have any further questions or want to see more of what you're doing with strength training and running?
Yeah, I'm more than happy for anybody to email me. My email's r.c.blagrove at Loughborough, which is lboro.ac.uk. I guess in terms of social media, it's only really Twitter that I'm kind of active on it in a professional sense. And so, yeah, my handle on Twitter is at @rich_Blagrove. And yeah, it'd be great to chat via that as well.
Cool. And then as a final question, if you had to listen to the Progress Theory, who would you love to have on as a guest? You think of sports science, running, that sort of thing. Who would be a great guest you'd want to learn more from?
I don't know if it would be possible to get these guys on, but certainly like Dan Pfaff and Stuart McMillan, like I've been a big fan of their work and followed them for a long time. I'm sure they're in demand when it comes to things like podcasts, because
yeah, I can imagine
from a coaching they're clearly outstanding coaches. I've not met either of them, but the information that they put out and their reputations and achievements over the years in terms of the athletes they've coached is pretty phenomenal. So if there ever was the opportunity to get one or both of them on, I think that would be tremendous.
No, that's definitely an aim. And if people are unfamiliar with the names Dan Pfaff and Stuart McMillan, check out Altis. It's where they coach and teach, and they do a lot of education there as well. So definitely check them out. I saw Dan Pfaff speak at the Arete Symposium, one of their conferences, and it was very good there. So yeah, definitely a future guest, fingers crossed. Anyway, Rich, thank you so much for that. I'll speak to you soon.
Yeah, thanks again for the invitation to be on, Phil. I miss our St Mary's Day, so it's been great to chat.
I know, the good old days. Cool, mate. I'll speak to you soon.
Thanks a lot, Phil.